Good afternoon, Madam Secretary.
Thank you. Welcome to the public hearing. You're welcome. You will now listen to the presentation from Tucows Inc. Please introduce yourself, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Elliot Noss, and I am the CEO of Tucows. I apologize that I tried to get people to stay with me, but I will be here alone. Tucows is a proudly Canadian company. We are the largest wholesaler of domain names in the world and the second largest domain name registrar overall. We've been in that business for 20 years. We offer fiber-to-the-home internet services in multiple markets within the U.S. and, of course, sadly, only in the U.S. And most relevant to this proceeding, we've been operating a top-rated MVNO, Ting Mobile, in the United States with hundreds of thousands of subscribers for more than 8 years. Our domain registration business is our largest business. Our fiber-to-the-home business is our fastest-growing business and the one with the most growth potential. Our MVNO is the least important of the three. And the Canadian MVNO opportunity represents only a 10% market increase for us potentially, relative to the U.S. market. We share all this to say that I am here today as a Canadian, much like in 2014, when I appeared before the Commission on virtually the same matter, although with some variations, of course. I am a Canadian who is tired of paying the highest prices in the world for mobile phone service. And I'm here as a Canadian with more MVNO experience on a day-to-day level than any other intervener that you will speak to in this process. Telecommunications services are infrastructure, just like water, electricity, and roads. Think of telephone service provided over copper networks. From their onset, they were regulated infrastructure with rate of return economics. When we introduced mobile phone service provided over the public resource of spectrum, it was for making phone calls and was considered a luxury. Today, it's primarily for using small computers like this, that we still anachronistically call phones, for consuming data. And it's for everyone. It is not a luxury. Lower income Canadians need access to mobile data just like other Canadians, not for occasional use and not at lower data rates like 3G. In fact, lower income Canadians are the most likely Canadians to not have a fixed internet connection at home and therefore have a much higher reliance on this little computer to consume their data. Telecom is infrastructure, and this leads me to my most heretical point. If telecom is infrastructure, and it is, then the desire for facilities-based competition is misplaced. We do not require facilities-based competition with any other infrastructure. In fact, it would seem absurd if we were talking about it in connection with water or electricity. You know, we spent a lot of time this morning and into the early afternoon hearing about how Bell differentiated on the basis of their network quality. We heard it dozens and dozens of times throughout the proceeding. It was summarized as we compete on the basis of speed and coverage. This is infrastructure. Wouldn't it be great for all of us if they competed on the basis of price and service? Isn't that what would be appropriate when talking about infrastructure? We talk about it in mobile telecom like this only because it was not viewed as infrastructure at the onset. Again, a luxury for making expensive phone calls. It is certainly true that mobile incumbents have invested billions of dollars in buying spectrum, again, a public good, and building out networks, and they've done that well. But they have been handsomely rewarded for those investments already, over and over again. We note that the best example of the fiction of the necessity of facilities-based competition is right in this room, although not right now. TELUS and Bell do not have national networks. They share one. Why? Because it would be economically inefficient for each of them to build the same infrastructure. They each build half and they share it. Let's not call this a hearing for MVNO. Let's call it a hearing for network sharing. Maybe we'll have a totally different frame. Canada is shamefully known for having the highest wireless prices in the world. And as confirmed by the Competition Bureau's intervention, our wireless carriers have net EBITDA margins that are also the highest of all the countries they studied. And we note that they do not do so with particularly lean operations. This is true in rural Canada, and it is true in the biggest cities. While it may be nice to talk about the term disruptors in relation to some Canadian mobile competitors, whether you're in Ottawa or Gatineau or Toronto or the most remote parts of the country, you're paying the highest prices in the world. I am here first and foremost as a Canadian mobile phone customer, and I have certainly not experienced disruption. But disruption is available. It's available with the mandated introduction of MVNOs. Everywhere in the world that MVNOs have been introduced, they have lowered prices, served niches like the unbanked and immigrant communities, and most importantly, and most obviously, raised the competitive bar for incumbents who were then required to actually compete. Every time one of the commissioners poked on why prices had moved positively, the answer came down to competition. You've heard that from every intervener you've spoken to. Canada is one of the very few countries in the developed world without MVNOs. When we looked at the OECD, it's us and Turkey, as best we can tell. In most markets, with the US as an example, MVNOs arise out of the competitive landscape. We're an MVNO in the US. We heard this morning a view of why we had MVNO in the US. That view, in my opinion, was fundamentally incorrect. It was because of market structure. In the US, you had a market structure of roughly 30-30, AT&T and Verizon, 15-15, Sprint and T-Mobile. And you also had with Sprint, not a company with excess capacity, that's arguable, I'll differentiate that in a second, but you had a company that had a history of a wholesale practice in the fixed wireline business. The original Sprint network coming out of their long-distance competition was one of the biggest IP networks, and they had a wholesale frame. They also had wholesale routes from their experience with Clearwire. So MVNO was in that market structure. Most countries in the world that have introduced MVNO have done so because of their market structure. And there was a very interesting discussion. Commissioner Leisner was asking about the differentiation between HHI and market shares or concentration ratios and why that might be used. The HHI is going to be lowest where you have an oligopoly. If you have 3 competitors at exactly 30% each and the rest of the market chopped up, what you have is the lowest HHI you could have for any way to split up 90%. That is math. So, many countries have mandated MVNO. France, Ireland, India, Brazil, Thailand. To read some of the submissions in this hearing and guest editorials in national papers, one would think MVNOs are rare and mandated MVNOs even rarer. We are the exception. And we are the ones literally paying the price every month, month after month. So the solution is right in front of us. But simply mandating MVNOs is not enough. We need two more things. First, the Commission needs to mandate the right kind of MVNOs. Second, the Commission needs to ensure prompt introduction of MVNOs and to enforce competitive standards and pricing. To make it easy for you, we will share how to do both. First, the right kind of MVNO. The Commission should introduce what the Competition Bureau calls broad MVNO access. I refer to this as software-based MVNO. This is not a mere reseller. In fact, in many ways, we today, as Ting Mobile, do more than the MNOs we compete with. We do our own billing. We do our own rating. When we want to institute a new pricing plan or an innovation, let's call it a disruption. We don't have to call Amdocs or another vendor and schedule a professional services engagement. We engineer it into our platform ourselves. That makes us more flexible and quicker to innovate. And I want to be clear about something else. If we are fortunate enough to have a positive outcome like this from this process, it's not going to be me, who's rather old at this point, who's going to be doing this innovation, in my view. We might participate, we might have some entry into the market, but the real innovation is going to come from one of a number of groups of 20-something-year-old engineers who are going to be faster and quicker and smarter than all of the rest of us who will be trying to compete here. That's what needs to be unlocked. You know, technology companies from around the world are now looking to Canada for young engineering talent. Some of that talent has poked at the US, some of it's been knocking on the door here, but that's what needs to be unlocked here. I fear our biggest hurdle in having the Commission see this point is the submission and presentation of the Competition Bureau. I want to note, I found their work extremely strong in diagnosing the problem. I did not agree with their proposed solution. Accordingly, I'll deal with their position in a bit of detail. The Competition Bureau makes three primary points in making their case for limited introduction of MVNO, focused on existing facilities-based competitors. First, the need for significant CRTC oversight, including MVNOs being less effective because of cost structure. That was kind of their first bucket of argument. The second was evidence of the success of MVNOs internationally is mixed. And third, mandated MVNO could have negative impact on the facilities-based wireless disruptors. I want to deal with each of these 3 points. The Competition Bureau is right. Mandated MVNO will require significant CRTC oversight. So will the policy espoused by the Competition Bureau. So did the roaming decision in 2015. I note that on the first day of this hearing dealing with MVNO, we had two parties complaining about roaming rates and one about customer win-backs. The Competition Bureau is right. The incumbents will do everything they can to delay. They will produce study after study and technical hurdle after technical hurdle. They did so for 16 years after the initial decision on third-party access to fixed internet facilities. I was a part of that process before I got this job. I'm in my 24th year, starting in April. If the Commission wants lower prices, they will need to engage in significant oversight, no matter the decision. It is either that or the continuation of the world's highest prices and the world's most profitable mobile carriers. You heard it every time you poked. We will do only what we are forced to do. The Competition Bureau also talked of the challenges of cost structure. This is also true no matter the type of MVNO. Again, we can see this clearly in the comments already tabled on wholesale roaming rates. What the Competition Bureau could more accurately say, though, is no matter what type of MVNO the Commission goes with, they will need to determine a fair wholesale price. That is unavoidable. This is something we at Ting know about from our experience in the US market. Importantly, the Competition Bureau only talked of cost of goods sold when talking about cost structure, but they should properly also consider operating expenses. Ting, and we expect many other MVNOs, are leaner and more efficient than incumbents. We can provide much more detail in this regard, but we believe that the operating expense advantage is significant and can be demonstrated. On the second point, we were unable to find mixed evidence of the success of MVNOs internationally, and if it's cited somewhere in the materials, we apologize for missing it and would welcome it to being called out. And I will say, there was a specific study referenced. It's a study that I read years ago. I reread it. I did not see this mixed evidence and would love to speak to the Bureau about that. We have relationships with MVNOs and MNOs all over the world. We strongly believe the evidence is overwhelming that MVNOs are the source of both significant price competition and significant service innovation, and cause MNOs to increase their competitive efforts. The clearest analogs to Canada would, of course, be the US, France, the UK, and Australia. And in all four, MVNOs have overwhelmingly contributed to the better outcomes in those markets. Australia might be the best example because it's as big as Canada. It has as low a population as Canada. Look at the pricing and look at the market share for MVNOs. Finally, the Competition Bureau fears that a broad MVNO mandate could harm the existing facilities-based competitors. This is fatally flawed, as they seem to believe that these facilities-based competitors have already contributed significantly to the Canadian mobile market. These companies have essentially come just under the pricing umbrella of the most expensive MNOs in the world. Of course they have gained some customers. They are less expensive than the extremely expensive. This has not moved Canada's place in the tables one bit, nor will it. I commented in detail on the mistake in focusing on facilities-based competition above. I will simply ask here that the CRTC not make the same mistake it did in 2015. In that decision, the CRTC tiptoed right up to the edge of introducing MVNOs. I remember reading that decision, and I remember my excitement building and building and building to the conclusion, and I felt like I was missing pages. And instead, what that decision did was put its hopes on intending to aid facilities-based competitors. Within months, Wind was sold, benefiting a small number of wealthy shareholders by hundreds of millions of dollars. And even a $10 a month impact from MVNOs at that time would have saved Canadians over $15 billion by now. Through my eyes, that is the cost of that decision. And you've heard a couple times, both in the Competition Bureaus and other dialogues, well, let's just try something else for another few years. When is enough enough? Please don't make the same mistake again. Please mandate software-based MVNOs. Secondly, we strongly urge the CRTC, as part of their decision, to create a fast track to a set of pricing and a technical implementation. We would be willing to confidentially provide the Commission with as much information as we are able to regarding wholesale pricing in the US and other markets. We would also volunteer to help the Commission with an initial technical implementation. We have tried facilities-based competition in mobile services since 2008. It has not worked. It's time to try the obvious solution that has worked all over the world. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your submission. Commissioner Barrett.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Noss.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a few questions for you, and I think I'm going to start with your most heretical point in page 1 of your presentation. So I guess your view is that there is already enough infrastructure in Canada such that we do not need to incent any more build-outs. And so I would like your view on that, and as well as whether you believe that the existing infrastructure provides enough capacity to enable a broad-based MVNO entry.
Yeah, so two pieces there. I'm not absolute about that at all. I run and maintain networks myself. Networks maintain ongoing investment, and networks maintain ongoing expansion. Certainly, there is significant growth in mobile data consumption, and we can have a longer discussion about 5G in particular. But what I would say is the cost of maintaining and operating world-class networks can be well covered off in a wholesale price. One of the things that telecoms around the world, mobile telecoms, have been saying since I've been in this business is, well, you know, if we have to supply our networks, we can't make enough profit. There's two things about that. It's not a complete sentence, in my view. What they're really saying is, given our existing cost structures, we can't make enough profit. I can tell you that I don't know a telecom in the world that efficiently does billing, that efficiently does customer service, and by the way, does customer service to a level that people enjoy. What we're doing in the US is providing customer service which goes right through the software stack. You can't provide great customer service without a great platform. We're doing that with the highest levels of customer satisfaction really in the world. Our net promoter scores are among the highest in the, are, as far as we know, the highest in the world in mobile phone service. Those other operating advantages, we don't think we're special. We just think we're not a telecom. Those other operating advantages would be benefited from others who entered the market as well. We do think incumbent telecoms are strong at building networks and running them, and that would allow a focus. But you want to think about networks as three pieces. You have the capital that goes into building the network, you have the construction and maintenance of the network, and you have the service that runs on top of it. There are many examples. We have, you know, the electricity market is a great one, where it operates with a clear separation between those pieces. So I don't think at all that it's about just we have networks are good enough and we don't have to keep working on them. But we don't need a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. I don't believe that accomplishes anything for us but providing a fourth or a fifth or a sixth water provider. And again, the existence proof for that is what Bell and Telus do already.
Okay. So you tried to enter the Canadian market as an MVNO. You mentioned that you were unable to pique the interest of the incumbent mobile carriers. Can you explain what your experience was and why it went nowhere?
Well, I can explain what my experience was, but I think they would have to explain why it went nowhere. And I would note that we spoke with two of the three we did not speak with the third. I think the answer was the experience was, as saying is in another context, short and brutal. One gave us, pretty clear sight to a no. The other had us jump through a hoop of filling out forms that included questions like, please anticipate, your demand. And we, of course, said, well, what's our price? And, we're happy to tell you what our demand was. Well, we can't tell you that. I will say, so those were just, there was really nothing to them. I will say that once it was clear that this hearing was going to take place, one of the parties did reach out to us, and, well, I reached out to them, and they said, if you want to show us what it might look like, I'll sort of take your submission. But again, at that point, it was rather late in the day, and.
So I understand negotiations didn't get very far.
No. There was not really what I would call in any sense a negotiation.
Okay. But did you propose a term?
No.
Okay. All right. Maybe you can explain or give us tell us about your experience in the U.S. operating a Ting as a U.S. MVNO. How did you enter the market? What was your trajectory? Are you serving a national, do you have national
Sure.
coverage, or do you have regional coverage?
Yeah, so in the U.S., we entered the market. Our first contact with Sprint was in 2010. That was in the summer of 2010, maybe late summer. By October of 2011, we launched a beta service. February of 2012 went live with general availability. That was at that point, and still is, a national service on the Sprint network. So it's available everywhere. You want to understand that with MVNOs, you have a fundamentally different cost equation than you do as an MNO. The joke about mobile phone networks is, first call is $10 billion and the rest are free. When you're an MVNO, you are paying by the SIP. So we receive pricing that's per minute, per message, per meg. We know a fair bit about the history. We researched the history of the category before we got into it. In fact, in order to have my board greenlight the project, I had to explain to them why we wouldn't be like a lot of the failed MVNOs in the kind of 99 through 2001 or 2 time period, where you had big companies like ESPN and Starwave and Disney and others who were sort of trying to launch a mobile phone service. Virgin in the U.S. came out of that and eventually was bought by by Sprint. And so there was kind of this, this scorched earth in the space. We had a particular perspective on it. Given that marginal cost structure, again, completely reversed from the MNOs, we have essentially usage-based pricing. It's in buckets. So a lot of people would look at this, if our package in the U.S. was available in Canada today, it would be looked at as lower income, affordable use, occasional use, all of these things, except it would be with 4G, no limitations, and much, much more flexibility. The trajectory was very fast, the 11, 12, 13, 14 time frame. By 2015 or so, the market got a lot more competitive. When we entered the mobile phone market in that 2010-11 timeframe, my calculus was simple. There were massive net operating margins in the market. Verizon was in the mid-50s. AT&T was in the high 40s. That's massive excess economic rent that looked like it could be competed away. By 2015 or so, the MNOs and the market generally had responded. There were other MVNOs. Sprint already owned Virgin and Boost. AT&T bought Cricket as a lower-priced flanker brand, and T-Mobile bought Metro PCS. And a lot of the growth that you've seen in AT&T and T-Mobile over the last 3 or 4 years, as publicly reported, is actually in those flanker brands. And I would argue, too, or suggest that those are true flanker brands where there is real pricing differentiation between Metro and T-Mobile, Cricket and AT&T. If we had such a thing in Canada, I don't think we would have quite the challenges or quite the high pricing we do now. So now we've been relatively flat for the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years. In fact, our primary source of the little bit of growth we've had over that time period is picking up other MVNOs that were going out of business. Sometimes we bought them, sometimes they simply put them on our platform in combination with their carrier partners. You know, maybe they owed the carriers money. The carriers liked them landing on our platform. They'd receive a high level of service. But the important thing there is that wasn't a disaster scenario. The market took care of it when there were a lot of competitors, some of whom didn't do so well.
Thank you. So can you describe the MVNO model that you are operating right now? Is it more of a full MVNO where you have access only to the RAN, or is it more on the lighter side?
Yeah, so ours is software-based, what I call software-based. In other words, we integrate with an API that the carriers provide us. I would note that I believe all 3 of our carrier partners get that platform that we integrate with from billing providers who are established in the market, big companies. In other words, all an existing MNO would have to do is write a check to be able to offer exactly that same software basis. We have asked for greater facilities basis over the years. One of the ironies in the process that we see is that in the U.S., where we're negotiating commercially, we look at the greater facilities basis as something that's a benefit to us. Our carrier partners won't allow us to do that. And the reason is, for us, it gives us more control over our customers. Those could be our SIMs. We could move from supplier to supplier more easily. We could do more with pricing and some of the features that you can embed in the devices, et cetera. So kind of the move from software-based MVNO to more facilities-based is a benefit to the MVNO, not the MNO and not the country, certainly.
So it's not by choice that?
No, we would have built our own core if we were allowed to. There are I believe only Sprint has allowed that, and I believe it's only in 4 specific cases, and each of them has their story. And then there's other bits of innovation. You know, you see Google Fi has a deal with both T-Mobile and Sprint. This is all pre-merger, of course, where they could do things like hop over networks and have phones with 2 SIM slots in them. Those implementations have also not been available to us.
Now, you have MVNO agreements with Sprint, T-Mobile.
Yes, and
Verizon?
And now Verizon. So we no longer have an arrangement with T-Mobile. We still offer service on their network through an MVNE, which is a mobile virtual network enabler.
I see. So am I to understand that the agreements do not prohibit you from reselling capacity to other MVNOs?
They do. That's actually around brand more than anything else.
Okay.
So I've mentioned right at the very beginning, we're the largest domain name wholesaler in the world. One of the original premises was that we would sell on through these reseller partners. we could only do that if they were selling the Ting Mobile brand. So we couldn't allow them to have their own brands. And you would imagine, we have big customers like Shopify, Squarespace, Wix. You could imagine that some of them would like their own brands.
Okay, so it's restricted to the Ting service.
That's right.
And these agreements, do they restrict you in any way from competing with the host carrier? So from Sprint?
One of the three has some nature of restriction. Two of the three do not. The one that does is a threshold that limits us from basically targeting their customers specifically.
Okay.
So if you were to put this in the context of perhaps, Bell became our MVNO partner, our supplier, our MNO supplier, they might say, our market share is 34%, and you can't add, or there are financial penalties for adding more than a third of your customers from us, something like that.
I see. I was going to ask how those restrictions are actually.
Yeah, and it just becomes more expensive.
Okay, I see. So it's restrictions based on a number of new acquisitions if they happen to be from the host carrier's
That's right.
existing base. Okay, I see. What about roaming? Do the MVNO agreements that you have include roaming?
Yes, they do. And that's very important in the U.S. market in particular, where you have Sprint and T-Mobile. My numbers now are going to be very rough and dirty because people will contest, what coverage they have. We view it that, each of Sprint and T-Mobile covers 260 million of 320 million or so people in the U.S. Nobody contests that in North Dakota there's really only one network. So that roaming is important. And I would note it's also a great place to call out a little bit of a little example, and I have a number of them, of where you get MVNO innovation. If you're on Sprint and you roam onto Verizon, who's their roaming partner, you pay extra. We looked at the preponderance of that. We looked at how often that happens, and we just baked it into our price. We felt it was an area of customer dissatisfaction, and we could take that on as an additional feature. And it's a small thing, but it's one of those small things that when it happens, you go visit your aunt in North Dakota for 2 weeks and come back with a $240 bill, it matters. So it's just a great example of the type of thing that an MVNO is likely to do, but an MNO would not.
Okay. Now, right now your agreements are using the 4G and the LTE network. Do they contemplate the 5G network?
Yes. So they contemplate it. Let me be more specific. It is actively part of our discussions. There is certainly no suggestion from any of our partners that as that becomes relevant, that they're going to withhold it. And where you'll see that become relevant is when the device universe starts to mature into the next cycle. So that's probably not going to be an issue for 2 or 3 years.
Thank you. Now, earlier you spoke about the target consumer for the Ting service, it being maybe the more value-conscious consumer. And we heard arguments over the course of the last 2 days that MVNOs in Canada would be targeting that type of consumer, which happens to be the consumer of the regional competitors. Would this be your view as well, that the regional competitors would be the ones from which an MVNO in Canada would gain most subscribers?
My short answer would be no. We view our target market as a shrewd or savvy customer, a frugal customer, as opposed. So that's more about their orientation than their income level. Our demographics back that up. There's some disappointment in that for us. We do think that lower income consumers could take much more active measures to manage their data consumption and not need as expensive mobile phone plans. I will note the U.S. has a much worse problem, I believe. I'm more familiar with the data in the U.S. around lack of home internet. I think if I have my numbers correct, in the African American and Latino communities, over 40% of households do not have home internet. So there you're relying on mobile internet, which is just a terrible double whammy. That's that's a market structure problem that they have that I think that we don't. In our fixed business, we're doing some very interesting things there, but that's separate. I think that what we see, our average device pays us about $23 a month. That's U.S.
So you're suggesting that there is an untapped market in Canada?
There's an untapped market, but what's important is I'm just going to look up at the panel of commissioners, and I'm comfortable that I would say your average data usage a month is comfortably below, not Wi-Fi now, mobile, comfortably below 2 gigs, comfortably below. Our average, our mean, is about 900 megs a month. So our customers do self-select for that. But that's the mean. The median is about 270 megs a month. You would be shocked at the data around the distribution of data consumption. I am sure that many of you on the panel and in the audience, well, there's not that many of you here, but are paying a phone bill for a teenager whose consumption is 5, 8, even 10x what yours is. So I think what you would see is the opportunity for the average Canadian to significantly lower their phone bill. And when 90% of the market is with the 3 MNOs, again, it's just math. That's where the customers are going to come from.
We spoke a little bit about capacity earlier. You argued that in the U.S., MVNOs are able to more efficiently use the capacity than are the MNOs. Would you say that in Canada, we have not seen MVNOs because capacity is already being used efficiently?
Sorry, I was relating efficiency to operations, not to data usage. I mean, we haven't seen MVNOs in Canada because this is a very cozy oligopoly with the highest prices and the highest profits in the world, and you have not yet forced them to do so. It's very simple.
You spoke about, or we spoke about the lower-end consumer, the more price-sensitive consumers. When you consider an MVO model in Canada, are you considering business customers as well, or is it limited to the residential type customer?
I mean, so first of all, the concept of business customer has really changed in the last, let's say, 5 years. Again, if you go back to the onset of mobile phone service, and I think it's important to remember, here we are today, mobile phones, mobile networks, small computers on a data network as infrastructure. At their onset, they were phones for infrequent use at a very expensive price. So businesses that still supply their employees with phones are starting to become an anachronism. So the short answer is yes, but that's not that relevant anymore.
Okay. And how would you target these consumers? You spoke about price differentiation, product differentiation. Can you explain how
Sure.
you would differentiate an MVNO from what is currently offered in the market?
Sure. So I think that, again, I'd encourage you to look at our website and see the pricing. I should note that a lot of our innovation and a lot of the innovation of a couple other MVNOs in the U.S. market really formed the basis for T-Mobile's whole Un-carrier strategy. Yeah, I think they did a great job of fast following and had a much bigger megaphone than we did. But you see things like we don't have plans, we have rates. When you have a plan, you need to guess what you're going to use. And the way that you have to do that in Canada, you know, we heard about insurance this morning with Unlimited. There's insurance in every single plan you choose in Canada. Because what you don't want is that club over the head of overage or the pain of having to change your plan. You know, I've got to call my telecom. I'm going to have to reserve my Saturday morning, you know, and on you go. Rates instead of plans is a huge difference. Second big example there, we have only lowered our prices over the 8 years we've been in business. We did it twice. But we didn't do that with teasers, with specials that lasted 12 months and then came out of market. We just lowered the rates for every one of our customers. We sampled, and something like 90% of our customers didn't know we lowered the rates. Many probably never even realized. Many didn't realize until they got their next bill. So that's a fundamental difference. There's, you know, I'm going to tell a great Canadian story again in the US. You know, some of you will remember that if you go back a decade, you roamed outside the country as a Canadian mobile phone user. You paid heinous prices in the US and everywhere else in the world. A small Canadian company out of Vancouver, a smart young entrepreneur, went and cut a US MVNO deal and started Roam Mobility. He had 2 or 3 years of great business. And then the first Rogers and then the other two, fast afterwards, copied him and launched the whole Roam Like Home thing. $5 in the US a day, $10 everywhere. He was still less expensive, but it was close enough that the hassle of taking a SIM in and out really sort of put the brakes on his business. And it was flat. He was doing other things in technology. We actually bought that business and still operate it today, but primarily as part of a prepaid thing. You know, we don't promote much in Canada, but that business had really come down. Once that was no longer a threat, 5 and 10 went to 7 and 12. So what you see there is the cycle of innovation, forcing MNOs to become more competitive, and once that threat's gone, back goes the price up.
So I did go to your website and I noted your monthly bill estimator, and I want to draw your attention to Exhibit 2, if you've had a chance to look at it. It was provided in the first day of the hearing, and it lists many of the plans that are currently offered
I believe it's
by
at the
wireless
back of the
operators.
room. Yeah, thank you. If somebody could run that over.
Essentially, it's a series of plans ranging in price from $5 to $15 that are currently available.
Yep.
Now, if Ting were to become an MVNO in Canada, are you confident that the rates that Ting would be offering to its occasional use customers would be competitive with what is currently offered by the carriers?
So yes, and I want to say I don't like the term occasional use. You would be, I'm going to encourage you and every commissioner to estimate how many minutes you think you use on the phone now, and then check your actual usage on your bill. I think you'll be shocked at how low the minutes of usage are. The problem with the occasional use or the lower income plans that are laid out here are they either don't include data or they include 3G data. We, again, are not limiting. So now imagine you have a phone, you use it how you use it, you have low-priced bills, but 1 month something happens. 1 month you have a relative who's in the hospital and you're sitting in the hospital room for some number of weeks, et cetera, you would be amazed at the variation across 12 months in people's usage. So the ability to spike your usage without being punitively dealt with for it is huge. So yes, and I think that the short answer is yes, and I think that a static look doesn't capture some of those very important subtleties: variability of usage, real 4G data, the ability to take that up, to whatever you need in a given period.
Thank you. I want to change gears a little bit. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the Spring T-Mobile merger from an MVNO perspective. Do you think this will reduce MVNO activity in the U.S.?
We have a fairly lengthy submission with the FCC on this. So there are comments that are publicly available. We do think that Sprint was probably the most MVNO friendly of the big four. So this cannot help but hurt somewhat. We will see. The good news is that Verizon, in the last couple years, I mentioned before that T-Mobile bought Metro, AT&T bought Cricket, Verizon is taking the role of arms merchant rather than going out and buying another brand like that. And Verizon does have the best network in the U.S. And so I think that merger in isolation will hurt the MVNO market, but I don't know that the MVNO market overall is going to be worse. That'll be because of Verizon's kind of upswing as a supplier.
Thank you. Now, flanker brands. The Canadian MVNOs own and operate several of these flanker brands. And your view is that they are unlikely to be disruptive.
Well, they're just still very expensive. There's no other way to put it. I mean, they are simply still very expensive.
So it's a price point.
Yeah.
Okay. You also argue that MVNOs via the flanker brands are being used to gather customer data and profiles, and that these profiles are then being used to market aggressively to those customers to have them go into one of the flanker brands of the incumbents. You gave the example of customers of Bell's prepaid MVNO brand Lucky being texted to join Virgin Mobile. Can you expand on that, or do you have any
I'm going to have to check back with my policy folks on that one.
Okay.
You sure that's our submission?
I believe it's your submission.
I suspect you're right. I'll find out.
Anecdotal.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll provide an undertaking to get to the bottom of that one and get you an answer.
Okay. Thank you. Now, in your view, is there anything wrong with customers' needs being met through these flanker brands?
Anything wrong with? No. Not on its face. No, not structurally. I just don't believe it will happen. There's no incentive. In fact, there's every disincentive. Look, one of the things that's very important that you heard over and over today that I think was wrong as well, and once again, is just math. You were told by Bell that they had two choices if there was MVNO. They could cut operating expenses and jobs and all sorts of other terrible things over here, or they could spend less on networks. That is simply not true. There is an obvious third choice, and that is lower profits. We heard with more passion than I heard on any other point how it is impossible to cut a dividend. I have a story about Frankfurt, New York, and Toronto as well. When I'm in Frankfurt seeing shareholders, they ask me why Canadian mobile phone prices are so high and why we're not getting into that market. When I'm in New York recruiting employees, I have to warn them that when they come here, there are so many things that are great, but your telecom prices, those are going to be kind of ugly. And when I was in Toronto coming here, I was on the phone with a reporter, clearly talking about telecom. My Lyft driver, when I got off the phone, said, "Oh, are you in telecom?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What can you do about my mobile phone prices?" Proceeded to tell me how he was from Bulgaria, had come here in the last years, and when I go home, I pay $5 for a SIM card with 8 gigs on it. I stay for a month, I can't use the 8 gigs. I come back here, and then he told me his story about how one had treated him terribly with a bait and switch that ended, and that he left them, and he went to the other one, and then they called him back and offered him, and he said, "Why didn't you do that before I left?" I mean, it was just, I didn't have to do anything. So, I'm going to tell you that you're choosing between a shareholder in Frankfurt and 30+ million Canadians as to where you weigh your scales.
Thank you. Now, you proposed that in mandated MVNO access should be restricted to entities that do not have market power. And your position was that it would be justifiable in the public interest because it would allay concerns of the new entrants that are facilities based. Could you maybe expand on which entities you believe have market power and where?
You know, I thought about this a fair bit as, you know, we put in our submissions, you see, we didn't have a lot of supplemental. And in reading others, I'm not sure I feel as strongly about that. I know that what I was afraid of was people leveraging it. What we were afraid of was companies that could be really of concern for reasons that I would understand to the MNOs, almost ruining it, ruining the program by leveraging it to detriment. And I'm not sure that I would make too much of that point at this point.
Okay. Is it fair to say that you would, or your position is that all of the 3 national carriers should be mandated to provide MVNO access?
Yes.
Okay. Should the regional carriers be obliged to
I don't believe so. I would say to you that I would encourage them to, because I think it's a great way to be more efficient in your operations, and it's a great way to reach segments that you might not otherwise.
Okay. I'm going to bring you back to just one more point of view that you had in your submission. You said that if there were more carriers offering wholesale MVNO services, that this would perhaps result in wholesale price competition as well. Is this your view as well?
Absolutely. And my view is also that they'll never do it.
Okay.
I mean, you know, I wish to be clear as I can. I don't feel like you have any choice. You know, you haven't asked me yet, and you know, maybe Chairperson Scott, you know, you've been the one asking on this point a lot around arbitration, mediation. I would say it would be futile to even engage in a commercial negotiation. I don't think they have any incentive to. I don't think they would have any intention of reaching a good outcome. That's why you hear us say very clearly, you know, we think you have to start with a price. You know, they'll dispute it. There's no question about that. And maybe we end up in arbitration from there. By the way, I would really like to reinforce what I heard from the Cogeco team around a baseball-style arbitration. I love that because it moves it from the evidence and who can buy the best expert and buy the pound study to a real commercial situation. You're put to your election and you're forced to come to the table with your best.
Thank you. Now, hypothetically speaking, if we were to mandate wholesale MVNO access, and without going into too much detail, what would be your entry strategy into Canada?
Yeah, our start point would be what we do already. There's one element of our innovation that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the fact that we have no retail presence. It's online only. We were a direct-to-consumer brand before that was sexy. And that has important implications for both your operating costs and your service delivery. In addition to that, we have the highest percentage, I'm pretty sure this is true, we believe it, we run it by all our carrier partners and nobody's told us otherwise, the highest percentage of BYOD, bring your own device, of any significant player. So we've got a lot of online tools that make it easy for you to bring your device, get a SIM card, get started. There are a lot of other MVNOs that will use us for checking their devices or things like that. People will send their customers to us to sort of facilitate some of those BYOD processes. And it's very important to know, we heard lots so far from multiple parties about the cost of devices. Devices have plateaued. If we're concerned about affordable phones for Canadians, for $139 today, you can get an excellent phone that will have the same specs as a top-end phone from maybe 2 or 3 years ago. In other words, it's probably close to the same specs as the phone that I'm still using with no end in sight. The secondary market for phones is light years beyond where it was 3 and 5 years ago. And that primary market, particularly for non-iPhones, is remarkable in terms of what's out there.
Now, if the MVNO access was not national but provincial or even by city, would this change anything in your strategy to enter the Canadian market?
I think we would be much less likely to. As is, it's 10% of our footprint. So we remember that what we then have to do is take energy away from adding customers to the existing service and spinning up a whole new service. I know that as Canadians, there's so many people in our shop who are so eager to do it that we will. I couldn't keep them back. But the smaller that got, the harder the decision becomes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your views and answers to my questions. I don't have any further questions. Maybe my colleagues have a question.
I have a couple of quick questions for you. I think you called us old earlier when you talked about
myself.
Our average data consumption.
I was leading with myself.
I'll forgive you for that.
Yeah.
One, I should just mention, for your information, if you're not aware, we use baseball-style arbitration as final offer arbitration at the Commission.
That's great.
Currently. Hearkening back to your first comments about infrastructure, it just seems to me, in effect, you're arguing for a monopoly. If, as you describe it, as a utility, for example, you said like electricity. Well, in Quebec, electricity generation distribution is entirely a regulated monopoly, and yes, it provides relatively cheap rates. I don't know about innovation, but I could easily take your arguments and say, sounds like the plan is one network, and then resell capacity?
So I would answer that as follows. I think if we were to wipe the slate clean and start with telecom fresh today, that would be exactly what we should do. We should do what Stocab did in Sweden in 1998 or 9, what Open Fiber is doing in the UK today. There are a number of examples of that around the world. And again, remember that that's exactly what we did with copper phone service. And
Pardon me.
I do want to be very clear, I don't have a way, and nor do I believe you do, to get there from here. So I'm not advocating for that at all. I think that, so I well understand, as a student of telecom, the various anachronisms that got us where we are today. The copper network is what it is. The next piece of infrastructure that has become today's telecom is the cable plant. But that was an entertainment product. It had a regulatory overlay, franchise fees, build requirements, etc. But it was not infrastructure in the same way. If you look at the definition of infrastructure that speaks to necessity and economic growth, you know, my parents probably feel that way about cable TV, but I wouldn't make that argument. So then what we all do is we're fighting the last war, where you had the cable infrastructure, which was for entertainment, and then the mobile phone infrastructure that came along with the sort of different profile that I've described a couple times now. So we are where we are. But I must say, you know, Chairperson, you tiptoed up there with 5G as well. Commissioner Barron went there as well, and I was fascinated by Monsieur Jeté's ideas around alternatives for 5G. You know, I want to bring you back to those comments. It's infrastructure. It should not be about speed and coverage. It should be about price and service. Speed and coverage, it's infrastructure. Think about running water. The only way to have better speed and coverage is to degrade it. Price and service is about the users of the infrastructure. So now we're all in the theory of second best, and how do we get there from here?
I'm not sure it is necessarily second best.
Sorry, that's a specific reference to an economic theory.
I'm familiar with it.
Okay.
I would note, for example, you used the UK example of OpenReach. It's not without consequences. They have adopted a wholesale model, and my understanding is you say it's not about coverage, but I believe fiber deployment is a challenge in the UK, and they are behind many other countries, including ourselves. So my suggestion is there are trade-offs here, and your answer suggests that it's very simple. It'll all happen. It'll get built. It'll cover everyone.
I'm not. Strategy is simple. Execution is hard. We have a lot of customers on the ground, and I know people in the ISP business in the UK, and they complain about that vigorously. You may know that Goldman just bought it. Goldman Sachs just bought that. We'll see. Maybe that'll improve. There are also competitors there. I'm talking about the model, and you know, I like the Stocab example better. You know, the situation with fiber in Sweden is fantastic. Coverage, price, competition, service levels. That's about execution. That's about a combination of a strategy for a network and a regulatory framework that worked. So I'm not, you know, it is not, good strategy without execution is never enough.
Thank you. Members, Commissioner Levy.
Thank you so much. Very interested in your experience in the United States, and I'd like to, you know, you've talked about the big MNOs, but the system does need investment, infrastructure, no matter how we get there. requires investment. So how do you create the balance that that spurs the kind of investment that's required?
Yeah, so there's a couple levers. One, there will still be a competitive lever. You could hand the pen over to me to design price and technical implementation, and I couldn't design a system that's going to take the market share from 90% down to 60% in the next 10 years. That just won't happen. There's too much heft already with the carriers. So in that framework, you still have a competitive dynamic. You know, unless they agree to degrade their networks together, in which case that'll open up for some of the other physical infrastructure players to do 5G. And there's one very important thing about 5G that I'd like to say. The primary beneficiary of 5G is the MNO. It lowers operating costs. It makes operation of the network more efficient. In this regard, I'd really encourage you to look at what Rakuten is doing in Japan and what Dish in the US in their now attempt to become the fourth carrier is doing. They're building next generation 5G networks that will be less expensive to build and significantly less expensive to run and manage. So that's one lever, is competition, which doesn't go away. The second is price. I'm not talking about doing this as a charity. I'm talking about a wholesale price that is profitable for the MNOs.
One last question. I'm interested in where you see the customers coming from, because it strikes me that your experience in the United States is that you and others in the space have tended to find niches that the existing players either didn't bother with, couldn't find, or there's just some new thinking that you brought to the mix. So how would you see trying to transplant that kind of innovation and thinking in terms of who your customer is to a country the size of Canada, where it's that 10 times smaller?
Yeah. So one of the things I used to say a lot when we would be asked about what's your niche, what's your target market, my answer would be customers who want lower prices and better service. So that, to me, doesn't feel like a niche. That feels like the fat part of the market. Now, I do believe that with the right structure, there will be a lot of innovation around niches. Companies like Leica Mobile around the world and all of the straight talk brands in the US target very specific niches for immigrant and unbanked communities. Somebody's going to do that here if you let them. That won't be us. That's not our natural market. We bring nothing specific to it. But somebody will. And then there'll be another half a dozen that we can't even imagine. So I do want to encourage you not to limit yourself or with my imagination or any of ours specifically. It's permissionless innovation.
Commissioner McDonald.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I confess I don't yet know where we will land on any of the issues that we've been discussing over the last couple of days, but I think we can agree that whatever framework may be put in place to enable MVNOs in the country needs to be structured in such a way that these new MVNOs are positioned for success, because I don't think it's in anyone's interest to know whether their provider will be there the next day. And I take it the good, the bad, and the ugly with the big three. No one needs to worry that Bell is going bankrupt tomorrow. So if there is a flood of new potential MVNOs. Like I said, we need to be sure that they're structured for success. So I'm wondering, can you give me an idea about the general profitability of MVNOs in the U.S. or in other markets?
Yeah, I think it certainly varies. MVNOs are not public, so there's not a lot, with the exception of us, and we do share a fair bit publicly. So what we know by anecdote and story and bouncing premises off of our carrier partners. And I would say that generally MVNOs are somewhat profitable. We're quite profitable on a net operating level, but we would love to trade some of our profitability for better pricing. Our problem is we need better pricing on our data rates, where it would make a difference for us, and that's not available to us right now. So I would say overall, MVNOs are the good ones, the efficient ones, are profitable. Some are for certain not, and are just sort of struggling to get along. And some are just well-funded and are acquisition plays. So the most important element there probably is remember that if an MVNO does go out of business, us as an existence proof in the U.S., but those are customers that any of the MNOs can pick up at that point.
Thank you for the comments, specifically as they relate to you. Is your profitability available online? I tried to get onto your website, but I need to download an updated browser before I can do that. So is that information publicly available?
I want to discuss browser compatibility after that. I don't know why that would be the case. So our overall profitability is available. Our a lot of our KPIs in mobile are available. If you go to the investor section, I think it's just investor.tucows.com. Okay. We don't do segment reporting, so that profitability is not. Information I've shared publicly is that we have gross margins in the high 50s, low 60% range, and we have strong net margins.
Okay, and just one final question, because you said, like in any other industries, there are good MVNOs, there are bad MVNOs from a profitability standpoint. You've acquired or merged with several. You said most of your growth as of late has come through acquisition.
That's right.
Were those acquisitions prompted based on synergies that could be created, or were they money-losing endeavors that you ended up just buying the customer base?
Yeah, in all cases, they were MVNOs that failed. So it's 5 different situations. I want to say we would generally pay just a bounty to the customers. We would make an arrangement. You'd have an entrepreneur who was going out of business, essentially, or wanted to. One case, they wanted to get out of the business. In another case, they were, in a couple cases, they were just going out of business. In another couple cases, we bought the customer base, but that's because those businesses had ideas that didn't work out. One was a freemium model, if you're familiar with that, and the other was kind of this philanthropic angle to it that didn't work out for them. But in each case, it was an orderly transition, where typically the customer would come over and get a bit of a service credit from us, so that their kind of their landing was somewhat soft, and we would just do math to make that work, with assumptions that obviously get polished over time around what we would be likely to keep from the base. The carriers like that because those customers were generally down market from what they would want, and that worked out for us and the people going out of business.
Thank you. And just one final, I take your point that a lot of the information isn't publicly available
Yeah.
on the MVNO market, but I won't hold you to this, but from the information that you've been able to glean from your conversations with other providers through your acquisition, what percentage of those MVNOs fall into the good, profitable operator bucket and those that are not able to be successful or are just hanging on?
It's a good question. I'm going to say, so two things. One, it's particularly for one of the suppliers in the market, they have a relatively low barrier to entry. So I would call the U.S. MVNO market rather promiscuous. And it's probably comfortably, more than half, somewhere between 50 to 60% work out, and the other, kind of 30, 40, 50% don't.
Okay, thank you. Promiscuous is not a word we often hear at commission hearings, so that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Council, any questions? Then I thank you very much. Thank you for your submissions and your fulsome responses. Have a
Thank
good
you
day.
very much for having me.
We will now recess for the day, resuming 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Thank you, Madam Secretary.